Welcome to the Foreign Policy Week in Review with Daniel McAdams. You know, we like to talk to Daniel weekly to hear what he has to say about what he reads and discovers is really going on in the world of foreign policy and geopolitics. And Daniel comes with a very rich background in that field, having been an advisor to Ron Paul when Ron Paul was a congressman. So really good to have you with me again, Daniel. Thanks for joining me again this week.
Thank you, Jay. It's great to be back with you.
Really always good to talk to you about the most relevant things, or at least, let's say, maybe not necessarily the most relevant things, but some of the things that are making the headlines, because we have the headlines that are, I think, increasingly controlled by a ruling elite, and so we are told what we need to know, and what they feel we don't need to know, we're not told, and there's so much that doesn't really come to light for most American people. So that's what we like to do, is shed some light, or have you help us see the light as to what's going on, what's really happening in foreign policy. Now, you know, this week, Daniel, the big news event was this horrible, this horrific burning alive of a Jordanian pilot that was captured. But there's, you know, as usually, there's a lot more to the story than what we're told. Can you shed some light on what was going on there? What was this pilot up to previously before he was captured, and maybe talk a little bit about the politics of this whole issue?
Sure, Jay. Well, he was, as you said, Jordanian pilot, and he was participating in the U.S. coalition against ISIS. Mm-hmm. So what he was actually doing when he was shot, not that this justifies what happened to him, is that he was bombing Syria without Syria's permission, mm-hmm. and he was apparently attacking Syria's enemy, or the Syrian government's enemy, ISIS. Mm-hmm. But nevertheless, he still was violating Syrian sovereignty. Well, he was captured by ISIS, and at least according to the videos that were released, if you can believe them all, is that they I guess beheading people is getting a little old for ISIS. They need to kind of spice it up a little, so they burn the guy alive, which, as you say, is horrific, and I don't mean to make light of it in the slightest. But a short little piece that I wrote for the Ron Paul Institute deals with the reaction on the part of the Jordanian government, specifically the King of Jordan, King Abdullah. You know, he was in the U.S. when this happened, and he, basically started swaggering and saying, "We're going to fight ISIS until we run out of bullets and fuel." And he was apparently, according to news reports, he even started quoting Clint Eastwood to Congress members. You know, so he was definitely getting his chest pushed out and his tough guy routine on. But the point that I made in this short piece that I did was, you know, now you decide that these rebels are bad, mm-hmm. because Jordan, for the last at least 3.5 years, was a very enthusiastic participant in the U.S. backing of these Syrian rebels. As a matter of fact, it was Jordanian territory that was really the entry point for so many of these radical jihadists from Libya and from other countries that came into Syria to fight against Assad. And, you know, to anyone who would say, well, are you accusing the U.S. and Jordan of creating and backing ISIS? Not necessarily. But guess what? There have been at least 5 or 6 times, probably more, that these so-called moderate rebels, the ones that have been vetted by the U.S., mm-hmm. once they got their training in Jordan on Jordanian soil, they got their training and they got their weapons from the U.S., they immediately went out and joined Al-Qaeda and joined ISIS.
Jeez. And,
and became, as a matter of fact, it was just, I wrote about something this past week where there was yet another group that was considered moderate that sent a letter and pledged their loyalty to an Al-Qaeda related group in Syria. So, so this is something that he certainly knew all along, and he was happy to do it because he wanted to overthrow the government in Syria. So, as I pointed out, these are kind of crocodile tears. They're not completely genuine tears because, as I said at the end, "Save the tears, Abdullah. You helped create this mess."
Yeah, the title of the article is "King Abdullah's Crocodile Tears Over Buren Pilot." And I think it's a lot of crocodile tears, or a lot of hypocrisy on our part to play this sort of thing up. And then, as I think you were pointing out to me, Daniel, that they say when people are when they're attacked by drones, they're incinerated, and I would imagine that, all of the bombs that we've dropped in Iraq and elsewhere have also incinerated quite a few people in the process. So for us, as horrible as it is, and again, I guess it has such an emotional impact on us when we see things like that, that it in a way it causes behavior that causes to trigger behavior. Obviously, if we don't know all of the horribleness of war, because it's so sanitized these days, isn't it, Daniel? I mean, we don't, we just push a button with some distant place on a drone and kill somebody, and we don't know anything about how horrible it is. But
exactly, and I think we do have a visceral reaction to someone being burned alive, because I think it touches our most serious fears. Even when I think about it, I feel panicky, and I'm sure most normal humans do. But as you very well pointed out, Jay, it is a fact, and the U.S. condemned this. How horrible! It just shows how horrible this is. We got to redouble our efforts. We need more money and bombs. But as you did point out, whenever the U.S. has collateral damage and kills a civilian, whether it be in Pakistan, in Yemen, in Syria, or whatnot, people who are killed with drones are burned alive for the most part. Mm-hmm. That's what happens. And the ones that do survive suffer horrific burns all over their body. So it is, you're right, somewhat hypocritical to make a big point about someone being burned when there are literally thousands of innocent civilians who've been literally burned alive by U.S. weapons.
I don't know. This whole Middle Eastern conflict just it seems so confusing to me and doesn't make any sense, because one day someone's our friend, the next day we're trying to kill them, and it goes with all these governments that we back for a while. They're our friends, and then we go to kill them and go to war against them. It's just insanity to me. I for the life of me, I'm having a real struggle trying to understand this stuff. It's so confusing. It's somewhat less confusing to me, at least, but is what's going on in the Ukraine, Daniel. And we've got actually, I'd like to tell our listeners, there's a very interesting interview that you did on RT that is posted at the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity, in which you were talking about how President Obama seemed to essentially be admitting the U.S. involvement in establishing a new regime there. And but I'd like you to comment on that, perhaps, and then also talk about what's going on geopolitically this week with the heads of Europe meeting in Moscow to try to find some solution. At least they say they are trying to find some solution with the Ukrainian conflict. Can you shed some light on that?
Sure. Well, it has been a pretty dramatic week with regard to Ukraine. If your listeners remember, this week started with the New York Times articles reporting that the administration was increasingly considering providing lethal weapons to Ukraine, which they have not done to this point. Of course, so we're told this crazy idea that they're only defensive lethal weapons. So I don't know exactly what that means. But it's interesting how the media in the U.S. is so lockstep, because as soon as the New York Times reported it, and of course their source was a think tank report, saying that the U.S. needs to do this. A think tank, if you look at who funds it, it's all the military-industrial complex that funds this particular think tank, or is actually a consortium of think tanks to put together this report. So then the Times reported on it. People are considering it seriously. And then every other paper in the U.S. Just completely followed the lead of the Times, saying the same thing. So all of a sudden, it can be reported there's a groundswell of interest in arming them. Well, the groundswell is ginned up as propaganda by the mainstream media in the U.S. Yeah. So it's very interesting. But nevertheless, so there's a groundswell early in the week to start arming Ukraine. And interestingly enough, and I don't want to put too much emphasis on it, but it very quickly, European leaders, particularly Germany's Merkel and Francis Hollande, they immediately stood up and said, we do not support arming Ukraine, and we will not participate. And there were, I think, several relatively minor players in Europe. I think the Hungarians and a few others said, this is a bad idea. We wouldn't have anything to do with it either. The U.S. pressed on, and Kerry went to Kiev on Thursday of this week to meet with the new government there. And, of course, they said the same thing they've been saying all along. The Russian military has invaded. thousands of troops have come in, and sort of the same things they've been saying all along. And I think the Europeans may have suspected that something dramatic was about to happen, and so they, in a way, they preempted the U.S. by Merkel and Hollande making what was reported to be an unexpected trip. I think the U.S. was caught off guard.
Mm-hmm.
They took a quick trip to Kiev and a quick trip to Moscow to discuss some sort of an alternative plan to the U.S. plan of escalation by arming one side in the conflict. So I think it's very interesting if the reporting we're seeing is true, that France and Germany took this upon themselves without notifying the U.S. government.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it says a lot about who's in charge of U.S. foreign policy and the level of trust or mistrust that they have engendered among their allies. So as we speak now, Jay, it looks like there might be some sort of a deal that's been brokered that looks somewhat serious. So it remains to be seen what the U.S. reaction will be. They basically were not asked to come play.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's interesting, and I would wonder, of course, this will probably give the Republicans more fuel against Obama in the upcoming campaign if there is some lack of unity between the NATO various components of the NATO forces. Don't you think that the Republicans will try to make some hay out of this if Obama can't keep the Europeans in line?
Exactly. The neocons will love it too because it plays into all of the stereotypes of the Europeans. So they don't have any stomach for war. What's wrong with them? They're lily-livered. Of course, all of the neocons have no stomach for war either.
Daniel, recently there was I can't remember which neocon it was, but he was talking about how we failed because we haven't kept troops in all these different countries and controlled them as we did after World War II. And I thought it really hit me then because we've never taken troops out of Europe. We've never taken troops out of Japan. We've sort of kept control of those places, of those countries. And now the neocons are suggesting that wherever we go, we should be doing the same thing, setting up permanently in these countries to control those countries. In other words, basically removing their sovereignty. It seems to me that that's what the push is for from these guys.
Yeah, and this touches on something we discussed last week, Jay, which is they always will say, whenever their plans fail, they'll always say, it's because you didn't do enough.
Exactly.
That was the problem.
Right.
And, McCain said that just yesterday, and I was going to write about this. I might try to do it if I can still. He said, he acknowledged that the government in Kiev, the U.S.-backed government, had used cluster bombs against civilians in East Ukraine, which is an international crime, on the tops of the list of horrors. But he said, they used it, but it's all America's fault because we didn't give them the weapons they needed up front, so they were forced to use these horrible weapons. So talk about blame America first, right?
Yeah.
There you go, McCain. Isn't that a horrible excuse?
Well, it may be precedent along those lines may have been set. I know reading some people theorize, and it apparently at the end of World War II, most of the generals didn't think it was necessary to unleash the nuclear bomb on Japan, but having done so, we sort of established who is ruler over all, I suppose. And so that's the sort of the thinking, the mindset, it seems to me, of some of these people. That we need to just, there's no morality to it. I mean, we don't need any morality. We are morality. We are the wonderful America. We bring with us, why would anybody not want us to go into their countries and tell them how to live? I mean, my goodness, we are so superior, and we have it all figured out here, right? Which is why our middle class is disintegrating and everything is going downhill. But that's another issue. Well, but this is a bit of good news, though, Daniel, potentially, that if Europe will stand up to and will not march lockstep with the United States dictates, this is a glimmer of hope, I think. I find it so.
I think at the very least it might forestall slightly the U.S. plan to send weapons. The other thing that I should have mentioned is, there were hearings for Ashton Carter, the incoming Secretary of Defense, this past week. And I believe there were hearings, but in any case, He's the designate, so he'll certainly get the job. But he said, "Oh, I'm all for arming Kiev. I'm all in favor of it."
Yeah.
And of course, this is a guy who came through the ranks in the military-industrial complex. His buddies are selling the weapons, or they're doing the think tank studies that say we need the weapons. So, I think if the best news would be if the European effort simply forestalled what seems at this point to be inevitable, the delivery of weapons. That will be certainly a tactical victory for rationality, for people who don't want to see another war. And I forget who it was that wrote about this week, but it's a very good point that the Europeans have had 2 wars on their soil in the past 100 years, and they know if the U.S. keeps pushing these buttons, there will be a Russian reaction, as naturally there would be with any country.
Sure.
And they're in the firing line if this happens. So there's certainly an incentive there.
Well, and there's incentive more immediately, too. I mean, and again, the Europeans are paying such a much larger price economically for the sanctions than the United States is. So it's understandable why there might be some pushback against the United States' vision of what should go forward, or at least, let's say, what the ruling elite want to do. Another note of good news that I picked up from from the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity website has to do with the Supreme Court ruling in favor of a TSA whistleblower, Robert MacLean. Can you tell our listeners about that?
Sure. This was a piece we ran written by Peter Van Buren, who's one of my favorite writers. He was a State Department employee who spent a year over in Iraq and wrote a fantastic book called We Meant Well. And it was all about the craziness of the U.S. rebuilding policy in Iraq. But anyway, Peter is one of my favorite writers, and he wrote this piece about it was a TSA whistleblower who tried to go through the channels with his complaint, and it was a complaint relating to a TS policy on air marshals, and because everyone says, oh, you should go through the channels. Snowden's fault was he didn't go through the channels.
Right.
Well, this fellow went through the channels and was completely ignored, and so he spoke anonymously to. He leaked an unclassified text message to the media, and then he spoke anonymously to the media about this particular issue. It had to do with airline safety, so it was irrelevant. It was definitely a relevant issue. Well, the Homeland Security Department discovered his voice. They were able to identify him by his voice and went after him, and they fired him, and they did all these things, and he fought back, and he used a couple of these nonprofits who help whistleblowers. The Government Accountability Project was one of his legal team. So in any case, what happened is that it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled in his favor. And I think to make a somewhat complicated story, hopefully somewhat more simple and easy to digest, there were a couple of really important elements in this case. One of them was the use by federal agencies of the classification process to retaliate against whistleblowers and to punish people they don't like. And in this case, the TSA, so the U.S. government officially only recognizes 3 levels of classification: confidential, secret, and top secret. But what these agencies have done, particularly since 9/11, and they've not done it through the force of law, they've done it through regulation. They've introduced all sorts of different hybrids. I think Peter wrote there are 107 different designations of classification for sensitive information. And so they will call something sensitive, and therefore if you release it, they will prosecute you. And so essentially what it is, it's an issue of federal agencies being able to make law. And the Supreme Court essentially said, no, that's not the case. You cannot make law. Law is made by Congress. And so I think that is that the implications for that victory, I think, are very substantial and very significant.
Yeah. I mean, it seems to me, not only in this area, but throughout our government, and I think in terms of the Bureau of Land Management, which I deal with to an extent because I follow the mining companies, you see the kind of regulations and the freedom that these regulators have to basically call their own shots and shut people down and do what they want to. and it's incredible. So this is we don't hear much about this in the media. I actually heard a legal discussion about it on Bloomberg, I believe, about this issue. But for the most part, we're not hearing about a whistleblower being exonerated.
Yeah, they probably don't want to trumpet it up too much,
No.
you know. And so thankfully, people like Peter in the alternative media, like Jay Taylor and hopefully RPI and others, will try to bring the news that's not being covered as much. But it is I think it is very significant, and I think it's good news if future whistleblowers are able to sort of piggyback on the victory that he's gotten on this.
Yeah, it's good news in the sense that maybe there still is some checks and balances in our government. I mean, that's what encourages me as well. I mean, this could be sort of a technical issue, but if the government, you know, if the three branches of government would only stand up and do what they're supposed to do instead of comply with the executive orders all the time. But, you know, Daniel, we have this executive order, and this president has used an awful lot of them, I believe. And the point is that who's going to challenge a president for executive orders? And if he can't be challenged for executive orders, then how is our president not a dictator?
Exactly. How does the Constitution survive? How does the separation of powers survive?
Yeah. So these are very, very important issues, and I guess, you know, as long as they keep the bread and circus in front of Americans and keep them happy and keep them fed, and you know, keep them, keep the beer and the wine and everything coming their way, then I suppose as long as there's food on the table and things continue on. But this is really serious stuff, and I don't know, anything else you'd like to add this week, Daniel?
Well, I'm most fascinated by and watching closely is certainly Yemen, which is potentially huge.
Mm-hmm.
You know, this Houthi movement that's taken over and overthrown the government, which is, they're Shia, but they're not as close to Iran, I think, as the neocons would like us to believe. But they've said all along they have no interest in governing. But what they've been doing is forming some alliances with some Sunni groups in Yemen. And now they've said that they're interested in looking into governing the country. So that's extremely significant, I think. And the other thing I'm watching, and Jay, this is probably something for another time, and you probably can handle it better than I can, but I'm fascinated by what's happening in Greece. I still have no idea what will happen because it seems to change all the time. But I tell you what, that is the flashpoint, I think, for everything.
Well, I agree with you on that. I think that Greece could be. It's just hard to see how there's going to be how there's not going to be a larger confrontation there, because the Germans are certainly digging in their heels on this and saying, "Oh, this is enough. We don't want to keep bailing out our weak brothers and sisters to the south of Europe. It's they're not even our brothers and sisters, so they're completely different." So yeah, I think it's going to be very fascinating and dangerous, potentially dangerous for the markets. A lot of, all of this stuff we're talking about, we go back to the basics, I believe, more than ever, that when we went off the gold standard and we allowed the military-industrial complex to grow, we allowed the government to grow in every which way. And it's just amazing. I went down to Washington in 1965 when I graduated from high school, my senior class trip, and I remember the city more or less what it was like then. And Daniel, how many times larger is that city now than it would have been in 1965? But but this allows the government to grow without any restraint. And then if the wrong people can create the money, and they have the ability to use it then to basically to buy everything, including research and think tanks and everything else, and put people through prestigious universities with prestigious letters behind their names and well-spoken people that go on television. And why would we ever question these brilliant, smooth-talking people, right? So it's a real problem, I think. But anyway, you're doing what you can. We do what we can. Your boss, Ron Paul, greatly love him and admire him, and many, many people do. So we have to keep doing what we can, Daniel. I want to thank you again for being with me again this week.
Thank you so much, Jay.